In this video, we're going to create 3 test cases for this route, the one that fetches an individual to-do item. One is going to make sure that when we pass in an invalid object ID, we get a 404. Another one is going to verify that when we pass in a valid object ID, but it doesn't match a doc, we get a 404 back. And lastly, we'll write a test case that makes sure when we pass in an object ID that does match a doc, that doc actually comes back in the response body. We're going to write the test case for the valid call together. Then you'll be writing these 2 test cases on your own. That'll be the challenge for this video. Over inside of server.test.js, we can get started down at the very bottom by adding a describe block. Right here, I'm going to call describe. And this describe block will be named get/todos/:ID. And we can add our arrow function as the callback function. Inside of our describe callback, we can now set up the test case that we're going to create together. It should return to-do doc. This is going to be the test that makes sure when we pass in a valid ID that does match a doc, the doc comes back. It's going to be an asynchronous test, so we will be specifying the done argument right here. Now, in order to run this test case, we're going to need the ID of a to-do that's actually inside of the collection. And if you remember, we do add 2 to-dos to the collection, but unfortunately, we don't have the IDs here. The IDs are auto-generated behind the scenes. In order to fix this, what we're going to do is add the ID property, _ID. This means we'll be able to access the ID in our test case, and everything will work as expected. Now, in order to do this, we do have to load an object ID off of MongoDB, which we've done before. I'm going to make a constant using ES6 destructuring. I'm going to grab object ID off of the return result from requiring MongoDB. Now, right here inside of the to-dos array, we can add an ID property for both of our to-dos. New object ID with a comma. This is for the first to-do, and down below we can add an ID for the second to-do as well. New object ID. Excellent. Now that we have IDs and we can access those IDs by accessing them off the to-dos array, we're ready to write the test case down below. Inside of this test case, we're going to get started by creating our super test request. We're going to request something from the app express application. It is going to be a GET request. That is the URL we're testing. And the actual URL is going to be /todos/ID, where the ID equals one of these IDs up above. I'm going to go ahead and use the ID of the first to-do. Down below, we can fix this by changing our string to a template string so we can inject the ID. /todos/ and then we're going to add our syntax for injecting a value into the template string. In this case, we're accessing something from the to-dos array. We want to grab the first item. This is the first to-do, and we're looking for its _ID property. Now, this is an object ID. We need to convert this into a string because that is what we're going to pass in as the URL. To convert an object ID to a string, we can use the toHex string method. There we go. Now we've generated the proper ID and we can start making some assertions about what should happen when this request gets fired. First up, the HTTP status code. That should be a 200. So I can call expect right here, passing in 200. Next up, we do want to verify that the body that comes back matches the body up above. Most notably that the text property equals the text property we set. I'm going to create a custom expect call right here to get that done. We'll pass in our function that gets called with the response object, and now we can make an assertion using the expect library. I'm going to expect that the response body has a to-do property, which we set up right here when we use the ES6 object syntax, and that to-do property has a text property that equals, using to-be, the text property of our first to-do. That's going to be to-dos, grabbing the first one, the 0 indexed to-do, and we're going to grab its text property. With this in place, all of our assertions are done. We can call end, passing in done, which is going to wrap up the test case. Now we can go ahead and run this test over inside of the terminal by running npm run test get-watch. This is going to kick off our test suite, and we should have our new section with our test case that is passing. Right here, we get should return to do doc, and that is passing, which is fantastic. Now it's time for you to write 2 test cases on your own. I'll give you the it calls, so we're on the same page there, but you are going to be responsible for filling out the actual test function. It should return a 404 if to do not found. This is going to be an async test, so we'll specify the done argument, and your job inside of here is going to be to make a request using a real object ID, and you're going to call its 2-hex string method. That means you're going to call the method we have here, and you're going to call new object ID to make a new one. It is going to be a valid ID, but it won't be found in the collection, so we should get a 404 back. Now, the only expectation you need to set up is the status code. Make sure you get a 404 back. Now, the second test you're going to write is going to verify that when we have an invalid ID, we get back a 404. It should return 404 for non-object IDs. This is also going to be an async test, so we'll specify done right here. For this one, you're going to pass in a URL something like this, /todos /123. This is indeed a valid URL, but when we try to convert 123 to an object ID, it's going to fail. That should trigger the code right here, and we should get a 404 back. Once again, the only expectation you need to set up for this test is that when you make the GET request to the URL, a 404 is the status code. Take a moment to knock out both of these test cases, making sure they work as expected when you actually have the calls set up. If all of your test cases are passing over in the terminal when you're done, then you are ready to move on. Take a moment to knock this out, pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, hopefully you didn't have too much trouble getting these calls set up. For the first one, I'm going to go ahead and get that hex string by creating a variable. Now, you didn't need to create a variable. You could have done it slightly differently. I'm going to make a variable called hex ID, setting it equal to a new object ID. Now, on this object ID, we do want to call that 2-hex string method, which we used above. This takes our object ID and gives us a string, and we can specify that string as part of the URL. Now, it's fine if you did this inside of the get call, kind of like we do up here. Either way works as long as the test case passes. Right here, we're going to call request, passing in our app. Next up, we are going to make a get request, so I'll call that get method, and we can set up our URL. This one is going to be /todos/ and we're going to inject in our template string that hex ID value. Now, the only expectation we need to set up is that a 404 comes back. We're expecting a 404. We can wrap this test case up by calling end, passing in our done function. Now we can save the file, and this test case should rerun. The last test is still going to fail, but that's fine. And over here, you can see we get exactly that. Should return to do doc passes, should return 404 if to do not found passes, and the last test to write is what happens when we have an invalid object ID. I'm going to call request, passing in app. Then I'm going to go ahead and call get, setting up the URL. We don't need to use template strings here since we're just going to be passing in a plain string. /todos /123 ABC. Indeed, an invalid object ID. The object IDs, as we talked about, have a very specific structure, and this does not pass that criteria. To find out more about object IDs, you can always go back to the object ID video in the beginning of this section. Right here, we're going to start setting up our assertions by calling expect and expecting a 404 comes back. And we can wrap this test up by calling the end method and passing in done. With this in place, our test suite for get to-dos by ID is complete. Over in the terminal, it just reran and all of the test cases passed. And this is fantastic. We now have a complete test suite set up for the route, which means we are done. And if the data comes back incorrectly, for example, if the body data has an extra character appended, like the character 1, the test cases are going to fail. Everything is working really, really well. The last thing left to do is commit our changes. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to shut down nodemon and run git status. Here, the only changes we have are changes to the server test file, which is a modified file. Git is already tracking it, which means I can use git commit with the AM flag or the combined AM flag, providing a message, add test cases for get todos by ID. I'm going to make the commit and push it up to GitHub. In the next video, we're going to switch things up a little bit. Instead of continuing on adding new routes, which we will do a little later, we are going to deploy our application to Heroku using a real-world MongoDB database. That means all the calls we're making in Postman, we can make, but to a real server. And anybody can make those calls, not just people on our local machine, because the URL will no longer be on localhost. That is coming up next. I am super excited to show you how to set up Heroku with MongoDB. Stay tuned. I will see you then.